ancestors got all the good copper. And I was like, wait, what? Copper is what's going to lead to The Last of Us? Why don't you guys just take microbes, iron and sulfur oxidizers, hit the pyrite, that'll lead to the chalcopyrite. Like, why don't you just genetically engineer some microbes to get to it? They looked at me like I was a space alien. Metals are one of the very, very few materials that can be recycled time and time again without losing their properties. Steel is the most recycled material in the world.
Welcome back to Clean Techies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. I'm Somil.
And I'm Silas. Each week, we publish the secrets to success from investors, founders, operators, and experts in climate tech around the world. Building a startup is hard. Building a climate tech startup is even harder. But we make it a little bit easier.
We put a lot of effort into these shows, so we hope you enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and let us know who you think we should have on next.
With that, let's get into today's episode. Hey everyone, quick note for you. You're currently listening to the free preview of this episode. If you'd like the full thing, the full shebang, go over to our Substack. That's cleantechies.substack.com/subscribe and become a paid subscriber. Any paid subscription gets you full access to the show on the Clean Techies Substack. From time to time, the connection between climate change and health is brought up. But I bet when you think of this, copper is not the first thing that comes to mind. Here's why it should. Data shows that as countries develop and electrify, two of the main beneficiaries are women and children. In order to electrify these countries, we need a lot of copper. Our guest today is solving that issue. Enter Liz Dennett, the CEO and founder of Endolith. You might recognize her name because we recently had Moji from Cemvita on. Endolith's tech originated inside of Cemvita and was recently spun off as its own company. What they do is use microbes to help recover metals from piles of crushed rock. Their technology allows existing mining operations to recover up to 10% more copper from their existing process. All they have to do is add this technology and they're getting 10% more yield. If you apply that to all mining operations in the world, it's a huge number. In today's conversation, we start with Liz's origin story of being originally from Alaska and then becoming the CEO one day of Endolith and a little bit of the kind of core pieces in between. It's actually really fascinating journey, if I might say so. We discuss their technology and how it works. And by the way, I will say, even though it's a deep tech technology, she does a very good job of articulating it in a clear, understandable way that you do not have to know a single thing about mining or microbes, and you will understand it. Trust me. Then we discuss the following macro topics: what green mining founders should keep in mind when building in this space, where mining needs to decarbonize. She basically lays out the kind of roadmap if you want to work on one of those areas. There's plenty of work to be done. How to strike the balance between generating hype around your technology versus actually, quote unquote, doing the science when you're building a deep tech startup. I think this is something a lot of founders struggle with. So she gave her insights there. And then how the US sees investing in mining as a national security issue. And finally, how metal recycling works. Very, very fascinating overall. And a pro tip to any listeners, if you want to see her dog, Flux, very, very cute, very fluffy, go subscribe and watch on YouTube. All right, enjoy the show. All right, welcome officially to the pod, Liz. How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm actually just back from vacation. It's my first vacation in 2 years. I did not bring my work laptop, which I don't know. I know people that take these vacations. I've heard about them and everyone's like, go on vacation, leave all your work troubles behind, go for a week. And I looked at cool rocks for the past week and I am back more energized than ever. So if you're listening, take a vacation.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And for anybody who's only listening, you should definitely go subscribe on YouTube because you can get a picture of the dog in the background,
Yeah,
which is
really
so adorable.
His name is Flux. He's living his best life. He's just the best.
Flux. I love that. That's a great name. To start us off, if you could have dinner with any climate tech OG or clean techie, as we like to call them, who would it be and why?
So I've actually given this a little bit of thought, and the first thing that popped into my head is obviously the Wright brothers. I was half joking about this earlier just because there's so much innovation behind taking this big, crazy, audacious goal and being like, I'm going to fly. And that if you've looked into their story at all, it's fantastic. The two, though, that I think are most impactful for the journeys I'm going through right now are Greg Jackson. He's the founder and chief executive of Octopus Energy. If you guys don't know Octopus, they've done a lot to make clean energy accessible and affordable. They have this Kraken platform. They do a lot in solar, but also who doesn't love cephalopods and octopus and kraken? Come on. Another one that's more specific to mining is Andrew Forrest of Fortescue Metals. They've done a lot with green energy, hydrogen, and real zero, which will probably come along earlier, who also doesn't love a very outspoken leader. I like people that have strong opinions about things.
That would be really interesting. I just saw. I think I have reference to that upcoming in some of our questions. But Andrew has been a little bit of an interesting character. You can always expect. I think he's originally from Australia, right? So you can expect those people to usually speak their mind, at least from my from my exposure. But that's cool. I really appreciate that. I guess tell us a little bit of the background for you though. Like what is your personal journey specifically into climate and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I never thought I'd have this job. I never thought I'd be a founder, CEO. That was never on my life to-do list, life bingo card. And in some ways, that's great because I never had preconceived notions about what to expect. I grew up in a little tiny town in Alaska, and the kind of place where if something broke, you couldn't just go to the store. I'm actually, I think, the first from my high school to get a PhD. I was voted most likely to get away with anything just because I had that very intuitive, like, we're going to have better ways to do things. We're going to challenge the status quo, which looking back on it is very entrepreneurial. But also growing up in Alaska, there's this balance of nature and camping and appreciating what's around you. But also, one of the biggest industries is the fossil fuel and the mining industries. And so you have to come with the way to hold those two dichotomous truths together. And how can you be an environmentalist, but also need to use the resources around you? If it can't be grown, it has to be mined. And so that, I think, was some of the early ways that I really was trying to figure out how to make peace with that. But I never thought I was going to be the head of a company. I always saw myself as a CTO, that number one, someone that would take other people's huge ideas and turn them into reality. I did go on to get a master's and PhD in astrobiology, working for NASA to look at how microbial life evolved on early Earth as a proxy for life on Mars. Done some really cool stuff in my career. I've worked at an oil and gas company, worked at a startup that was using genomics as a subsurface tracer. I was at AWS leading their energy data platforms. And then I was in Edinburgh as a VP for Wood. And there, one night, this is a story that I don't actually tell that much, but one night we were out at the pub, many drinks in, and I was chatting with some of the world experts in different research, chatting about what the thing was that was going to fuel the zombie apocalypse. And I was kind of like, oh, it's going to be fresh water, right? I was like, do you guys know how many gallons of fresh water it takes to make the chips in my phone? And one of the very wise researchers is like, absolutely not. There's so many people working on fresh water. It's going to be copper. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, let's recycle pennies. And they were like, Liz, think before you speak sometimes. There's actually not that much copper in pennies, blah, blah, blah. But no, like there's so little copper out there. 70% of the world's copper is trapped in low-grade ores. Between now and 2050, we need more copper than has ever been used in the history of civilization. Our ancestors got all the good copper. And I was like, wait, what? Copper is what's going to lead to The Last of Us? Like copper? Why don't you guys just take microbes, like iron and sulfur oxidizers, hit the pyrite, that'll lead to the chalcopyrite. Like, why don't you just genetically engineer some microbes to get to it? And they looked at me like I was a space alien. And they're like, why don't you? And I was like, oh, I guess I could. I guess I actually have the PhD in geomicrobiology and could. And so that led to a series of very fortunate events that got me here in Denver at the helm of Endolith.
Nice. No, I think that's a really great story. I guess the one thing I'll just reflect on quickly for people, for at least for me, is it just shows that a lot of people have certain skills that they don't necessarily recognize until kind of prompted in a certain way.
Yeah.
This is why it's important to surround yourself with kind of these people who will ask these questions and maybe even spend some more time at the pub. Maybe that's a good idea.
It's obviously the solution for everything. And it's a very interesting origin story hearing about it, especially since every chapter of my career has been so much different than the other ones. And telling people about it like, oh yeah, I was an architect at AWS. I built some really cool stuff. Like, of course you just do that. Of course you do that. What else would it be? And going into this chapter, realizing that fundraising, entrepreneurship, being at the helm, unlike anything else I've done, I envy many people that have done it right out of grad school or right out of college in their early 20s. I couldn't have done it. I needed to wait till I was in my late 30s and had the tenacity and had the financial safety net to be like, you know what, if this fails, that's okay, because I made so many mistakes. I can pattern match how these things go, and I know that I won't make these mistakes again.
You know that feeling when you meet someone who shares your vision for the future? It just clicks, like two peas in a pod. Well, that's exactly how we felt when we met Goodwin, who we are proud to have as our sponsor.
Being the first major law firm to set up a climate-specific startup and venture practice makes them exactly the kind of partner we are excited to work with. They realize that there are a plethora of challenges to building climate tech startups, and that's why they have built an entire suite of resources for founders, investors, and entrepreneurs in the space. They even offer several tailored pricing methods. And guess what? It doesn't matter where you are listening to this. Goodwin is a global law firm that you can trust to be your partner through it all. From incorporation to exit, they've got you covered.
Go to goodwinlaw.com and tell them Clean Techie sent you to get exclusive access to startup resources. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, I think that's actually a super underrated kind of method of going about it, because there is so much you can bring to the table if you do entrepreneurship, quote unquote, do entrepreneurship later in your career, because then you have a lot more, know how or know what not to do, basically. One thing I do want to make sure I understand a little bit about is how, can you just tell us the brief story? Because we've had Moji on the pod, obviously, in the past, but can you tell us how you ended up connecting with Moji and then ended up kind of spinning out Endolith? Give us the story of those two kind of things together.
I love Moji and I love Cemvita. And if you guys are like, who is Moji? Who is Cemvita? Check out the earlier podcast episode. So backtrack to when I was like, oh, I was at this biotech startup in San Diego. So the longer version of that is, once upon a time, I was working as an oil and gas geologist. It was a very interesting job. I was helping bring a new technology to this big monolithic company. And this amazing startup came and pitched. And I was in like the front row, like, oh, what kind of primers are you guys using? What does your genomics workflow look like? What kind of Jupyter notebooks are you using? And within a month, I left my job and moved to San Diego and was like employee 7 at the time. It was unlike anything I'd ever done. I was really living my startup dream. And I was hired as a senior scientist, made my way up to technology director, and I was the nerdy scientist paired with the best business development human I'd ever met. And we went all over the world trying to scale that company. And that business development human was Moji. And so he taught me everything I know about not being a robotic scientist, but actually working with customers and understanding what they need. And he left to found Cemvita Factory with his sister Tara, and I left to go join AWS. And I'd stayed on, I joined Cemvita as an advisor and then was staying in touch with them. And then about 2 years ago, they asked if I wanted to join as CTO. And my dream in life had always been to be a CTO, as I alluded to earlier. And it was amazing. It was the best job in the world for all of 4 or 5 months. And Cemvita at the time had really 3 different verticals underneath it. And one of them was this biomining group in Denver. And between Moji and the board, they asked me to really step in with my background and see if there was a there there. And I was a kid in a candy store. I knew the technology, I knew the microbes. The team here was so welcoming and warm, and we had to make some changes, set the company up. And long story less long, ended up spinning it out, making some alignments to really focus on a few key products, and then bringing it out to a fundraise. And we got here. We got here about a year later.
Yeah, I guess, are there any particulars, I think we've talked about this offline, but are there any particulars you'd want to share about why specifically to spin out Endolith as its own thing, and kind of like just like basic mechanics behind that for people who aren't unfamiliar? Because I do think there's a lot of other companies trying to build these like technology development research lab type things that are trying to commercialize things, and they will have to spin them out. So I'm just kind of curious if you can give us the basics there.
So the best words I ever got were from this wonderful woman, Hannah, with Planeteer. And when I was like, oh, we want to do this and this and this, and we're doing all this cool stuff. And she gave me an amazing line, which is cash is king, focus is queen. And that has reigned true, because everyone loves a platform. Everyone loves to do a bunch of things when you're successful. But early on, it is really hard to do 2 or 3 things. It is really difficult to do one thing. So having that laser focus and making sure that you can know everything, I can know my customers and what they're going to want just as well as they do, where I can really focus on that, is incredibly hard. Cemvita also at the time, they had 3 different verticals. Now they're laser focused on one thing. And also the reality is the fundraising environment now and in the past 2 years is very different than it was at 2020. And even talking to investors, they want to see you be an expert in one thing, which is really good advice. I don't have anything to compare it to because this is in many ways my first CEO rodeo, and I've really enjoyed that laser focus, having one solid set of OKRs and saying, all right, I need the investors that will set Endolith up for success. If we're going to do copper, low grade copper heap leaching using microbial communities, everything we do, we eat, we sleep, we breathe is around those. I have this one pager right here that's written in pencil. This is what we need to do to be successful. How can we show our technology works? It is, we need to do this and this and this. And everything we do at this company needs to go into this one pager. If anyone is doing something that doesn't go in there, they don't do it. And that laser focus is key because time is your most limited resource, and then it's finances.
This is sick. I feel like we've been led into like, you know how like Uber Mafia exists, PayPal Mafia exists. I feel like we've been letting into like the Cemvita Mafia, the microbial mafia of climate. This is super cool.
Also, I always joke when I'm talking to people about my time at AWS that you get your favorite leadership principle tattooed on you. So I always joke when I see them out in the wild, people that still work there, and I love my time at AWS. I love the people. It was one of the best jobs I've ever had. And so I always joke, like, what leadership principle? Do you have customer obsession? Which one do you have? Where's your tattoo? And distilling it all down into one pager, working backwards, like inventing your way through things. Those are always going to be core to how I approach things. Like no matter if I try not to, it's too deep. I'm too deep in.
Climate tech founders are taking on a huge challenge. Not only do they need to know how to build a startup, but they also need to deal with hardware, have a strong handle on climate policy, know how to fundraise from diverse investor types. It's a lot.
That's why we made Clean Techies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. In addition to our jobs, we devote 20 hours a week to producing this podcast for you. This way you can learn from the people who have walked the path before you, learn from their mistakes, and gain insights on navigating this complex journey. If this mission resonates with you, we are asking for your help. It takes a lot of effort and it's not free.
If you are already a subscriber and want to help, start supporting us today by going to Substack and clicking Upgrade to Paid. Thanks for helping all the climate tech entrepreneurs like you.
And look, to your point about like never expecting to be a CEO. I mean, one of the things that we have talked about a lot, and it's come up a lot on the podcast, is that in climate, you need and see a lot of the deep tech-oriented founder kind of taking whatever they're working on and scaling it. So the fact that you were trained in what is probably like, you know, one of the pioneers, not the pioneer in this space on how do you commercialize this kind of tech, like this is sort of the best of all worlds, right? Which is you have someone who knows the science, because you can't build a science company without it, combined with the leadership expertise you need to move forward.
If you are a PhD, though, going into this, it is the first time I went to pitch to investors, though, the first few times. And like I've owned big P&Ls. I've been around the block. I've done BD type work. I feel like I have a decent set of social skills. But the first few times pitching to investors, when I was like, okay, let's just talk about the technology. And they're like, well, let's see your financial model. And I'm like, oh, it's just money. Like we're seed stage. It's a seed round. Like the financial model is, you know, plus or minus 50%. Let's talk about the technology. So it was still such a learning curve. And I'm so grateful to surround myself with people that are better and smarter and more adept than I am. But it was definitely a big learning curve.
Yeah.
Do not want to sugarcoat that part.
Yeah, having those two things go together well is important. You know, one thing we always want to understand is, you know, we'll talk about the tech right after this, but in terms of if you can scale this to kind of a massive, like just, you know, it's ubiquitous across the world.
Yeah.
What would the impact of what you're doing look like?
So the cool thing about something like that, let me take a step back, because I mentioned between now and 2050, we need more copper than we've ever needed in the history of human civilization, which is crazy because that includes things like the Bronze Age. And if you go to a museum and see all those beautiful Bronze Age artifacts, those are mostly copper. All the copper that we're using now, that's the foundation of everything. Electric cars use 4 to 5 times more copper than their internal combustion counterparts. Like copper is the rising tide that lifts all ships. 70% of copper is trapped in low-grade ores, and it's really, really challenging to get it out of those ores. We have to use new techniques like this thing called hydrometallurgy. So quick, if you're ever on Jeopardy and this comes up, if you know, now you know. They take these low-grade ores. We are talking less than 0.3% chalcopyrite, which is one of the main minerals that contains copper. My dog just sighed loudly. He's heard this pitch so many times. So like super low, less than 1/3%. They crush it, they pile it high, and they spray it with sulfuric acid, essentially using sprinkler systems that lets the copper into solution. They electroplate it, it goes off to the races. Half of that comes out now, about 50% of that. If we can get 10% more using microbes, that is an extra $100 to $200 million a year per heap leach, like right now. And that's a huge impact. That's per heap leach. We love microbes. I mean, you should love microbes. You have 10 times more microbial cells in your body than you do human cells. Another fun fact. But microbes are the oldest miners. They've been around for billions of years. They're able to catalyze these redox reactions in a way that, yeah, you can spray more chemicals, you can spray more enzymes, but these microbes are little enzyme and chemical factories. And so we use them because at scale, they have a lower price point, they're hardier, they're these really great little microbe factories. So that's essentially what we're doing. The cool thing about the impact too is that for us, in order to be commercial, we don't need to be ubiquitous at every mine. We just need to be in a few. But we can get more copper out like today, tomorrow. I can talk at length about the geopolitics of copper in a way that sometimes makes people a little bit uncomfortable. But as I mentioned at the top of the show, I like people who have strong opinions.
Well, one quick follow-up is what is a heap leach?
That is where they take all those rocks that they crush and they pile them up and spray them. That's called a heap leach because they're heaping it and then leaching it.
Okay.
Little dance.
And
we
then...
could turn it into like a little TikTok or Instagram reel dance. Like they're heaping and they're leaching. Don't do that.
This is why I was so excited to have you on, because there's never a not fun moment. But so this is okay. So just kind of try to rewind this and summarize it. Basically, the technology is using microbes to extract more copper from these existing kind of processes. And the impact is that we can actually help achieve the amount of copper extraction we need to meet the demands of copper in the next coming decades. Is that correct?
We can get more. We don't know if we can meet it. There's so many unknowable unknowns at this point for how much copper we're actually going to need. One way to think about it, if you are in kindergarten, is that these microbes, they essentially eat copper, or they eat the stuff around copper and they poop out the copper so that you can get access to the copper.
I appreciate these simple examples because I am not a PhD in this, so this is very helpful. So I guess one thing I am curious about on this is you point out that this is very important because we have this huge incoming demand for copper, but and you mentioned a little bit about geopolitics, and maybe we can go into this, but is the reason that if we can't achieve more production of this, that there's going to be a lot of like possible fighting or concerns? Like what would it lead to if we can't achieve this outcome is my question.
Yeah. So as a scientist, I love primary literature. So let me lead with some facts from the primary literature. If you look at countries where they have grid electrification, developing countries, primary Indonesia, Bangladesh, areas like that, areas where there is grid electrification and people have stable electricity, mostly because they have copper wiring, they have electricity, women have more education and children live longer. Women also don't die in childbirth. So the people that benefit from electrification typically are women and children in developing countries. So that's just one point, which is pretty cool as a female. Yeah. I like education. As a highly educated female, I think that's pretty cool. So that's one of the points that's out there. And when we talk about the climate change, it's really easy for this to sink into. I've had so many people ask me, oh, how's the election going to affect your startup? What do you think about the politics? What do you think about like DOE or things like that? And regardless of politics on a more meso or micro level, at a global scale, all the data, or the vast majority of data that I have seen, shows that in general, more access to electricity, stable electricity means better health outcomes. And that's pretty cool. So therefore, extrapolating that, in absence of that, we're going to have a bad time. And that's just with copper. If you look at things like cobalt, for example, or the rare earths that go into your cell phone, that actually turns into a really bleak picture. That then touches on things like child labor, countries that don't have access to that. We can touch on artisanal mining. But in general, the more that we can get access to both rare earth elements and critical minerals in a way that's either domestic so that we can have our eyes on those supply chains, or we can have our eyes and have access to the vendors that have visibility to how they're being sourced, the better off we're going to be.
So it's really sort of the one macro that, electrification broadly leads to better outcomes in society, right?
Yeah.
Better societal shifts. I'll plug for a second. I spent a lot of time at UNGA week this year, actually, splitting my time with New York Climate Week. And I think one of the things that sucked the most, I'll surface this because I feel like you might have an opinionated take on this, but one of the things that sucked the most is because the events are at the same times, I happen to be one of the only people, if not the only person in my space, in the climate tech space, in the investing space that I know. So if we talk about, bringing electricity and electrifying the rest of the world, well, we're not talking to the rest of the world, right? And one of the fundamental reasons is the biggest week in climate tech is the biggest week of Africa, right? In terms of like the global relationship. So it just is so interesting to see how, of course, a greater electrification leads to, greater global outcomes, but people don't even have a forum to really think about that. I'm just curious, like, what's your perspective there on the copper side of it as well? I mean, you need to talk to so many international stakeholders. Are people doing it enough?
It's so funny. I have my UN pin here. We were so fortunate at Climate Week, which was the same UN General Assembly
Right.
week. We were just named one of the top innovators for the World Economic Forum.
Congrats.
So I got access to a lot of these events, which was insane. I have never been at events with billionaires before, and I've never got to talk to billionaires about these things. And to your point about all of our points about the strong opinions, because apparently this podcast is going to be about strong opinions and startups. It was really cool, and it was kind of one of those moments. I had it was at an event from one of our investors, Overture. They had a sort of Damocles event where they talked about the election and politics. And I love these conversations. But there was a big poster when you were going into the elevator and it said, remember who you wanted to be. And this was early on in the week. And I just kind of had this flash about like, oh yeah, I was like that vocal middle of nowhere, like I have strong opinions about this. And so that was great. And I have one of my UN pins right here that I keep staring at. Like I had this, remember who you wanted to be, who do you want to be, what is the company that you want to grow? Because going back to one of those points about I never wanted to be a CEO and founder. And with that, big risk, big reward. I'm working all of the time. This company is my everything. It is my reason for pretty much everything in life. And so you have to play it very safe a lot of times, but then there are times where you're given a position of power and of privilege, and you're able to speak to billionaires and talk about the things that matter to you. And at one point, I was like, I'm going to say my truth. I'm going to speak my truth to people in power because going through the fundraising process as a solo founder, female, I know that less than 1% of startup funding goes to white females, and the numbers are worse for my Black and brown colleagues. And I know that what we're doing is hard. I'm just gonna say what I think. And that was incredibly empowering. But to your point, it opened up so many real conversations, actual real conversations, not the superficial small talk about like, oh, you're doing a great job, keep it up, but actual people sharing their journeys with me, talking about how they'd been affected or their friends had been affected that inspired them to be here. And that was completely unprecedented. I did not think it was going to go down that way. So that was another surprising kind of call to action, is showing not even vulnerability, just kind of giving fewer F's and speaking your truth.
Yeah.
Surprising.
Yeah. I mean, so many of the conversations about what's next, to take example, Africa, you think that a lot of it's investment, health, but the number one thing that a lot of the business people and presidents and prime ministers are talking about is electrification, right? Clean energy, reliable energy. And I was like, where are the people who need to be listening to something like this, right? So I'm so glad to hear that you were in rooms where you could express that.
Yeah.
I think not enough of the best entrepreneurs of our generation in climate are doing that.
Because I can tell my stories. Growing up in rural Alaska, my dad's on an oxygen machine and we had rolling brownouts. We still do. And copper getting more expensive is only going to make it harder. Even in Houston, I was in Houston before this, somewhere where you think, oh, what, like the fourth largest city in the US, they should have no problem with power. But the power grid there is atrocious.
I'm from
However, we never had issues with power because the neighborhood I was in was predominantly white. And if you outline the gerrymandered districts, it actually overlays directly with predominantly brown and black caucuses that don't have issues to power. And if you unpack the layers, it's not one size fits all when it comes to who has access to power.
I think we could have an entire podcast, an
Anyway,
entire day talking about
that's
this
what
kind
I
of stuff.
really think about this.
Yeah. But let's talk about mining a little bit, something slightly less controversial. Although, as you said, we'll probably find a way to make it.
That is not true. Mining companies are seen as dirty, and they're seen as a part of the problem, a huge part of the problem.
Yeah.
And even telling people that we're doing sustainable mining, we've had
Like, I don't
investors
believe you.
that don't want to invest with us because we are part of the traditional mining problem. And that's not it at all. Is you have to work with the incumbents to be part of the solution. I honestly believe that.
Wait, that's really surprising, even to this day, because I think so many investors from my, investing groups, like, people acknowledge that you need more minerals. Are you really seeing that some investors won't invest in mining?
They won't invest in mining solutions that are working with the mining incumbents.
So from your perspective, can you break down sort of what are the core areas for decarbonization in mining?
So a few of the big areas are, one is using less hydrocarbons in terms of your infrastructure. So there's a lot of these giant trucks that you'll see on the mines, their tires are larger than you are. So using less of the hydrocarbons for those. So using things like hydrogen instead, electrification of those. Another one is getting more of the actual mining deposits out. So electrification, waste reduction, better management of tailings, reducing toxic emissions. And then the third one is that material efficiency. So using less energy to extract metals. So that's kind of where we come in. By using microbes instead of sulfuric acid. When you produce sulfuric acid, you also produce SOx emissions. And so by cutting down on that and having the bugs play an active role, you can have some decarbonization as well.
Got it. That's really helpful. I appreciate that kind of overview because it allows other people who might be interested in this space to know where to look and know where to dig. No pun intended.
It's a huge space. And keep in mind that these mines can go on for decades and decades and decades. And it really is a rising tide lifts all ships. We've been really fortunate to be in a few different group accelerator programs. We're in one with Founders Factory working with Rio Tinto. We're also in a BHP TAD Think and Act Differently cohort. And the benefit is you're around people trying to do the same thing. I do not see this as winner take all. There's so much room for improvement.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, for other founders, like, what are the main considerations that people who are building in this space need to have when it comes to interacting with mining companies? You gave a couple examples. Some investors won't touch you if you're working with the incumbents. Like, you have an opinion, you should work with them. So what are in your mind the core things that a founder in the, let's call it, green mining space needs to keep in mind?
Yeah. So first off is the mining sector has traditionally been very, very, very conservative. Especially in terms of innovation. And the innovation groups sometimes are very separate from the business units. I've seen this a lot in traditional energy space as well. There's a huge acknowledgement, though, even among some of these more conservative groups, that sustainability isn't optional. And you see that reflected in their values. Rio Tinto and BHP, for instance, both have done a really great job with their values that speak to how they want to be more sustainable, how they want to really incorporate ESG throughout the entire value chain. You also see that, like we talked a little bit about Andrew Forrest and his Real Zero. So you see that from some of the more outspoken leadership as well. But it's going to be incredibly long sales cycles. I was at a CEO cohort group and someone was lamenting that it took them like 8 months to sign a contract. And I think it took us 18 months to get one of our deals across the finish line. And that's just the way it works.
Yeah, but it's kind of, I mean, you effectively have to work with them, because if you're pointing out that these mines are in operation for a long time, the fact that you're a startup, and if you're going to try to actually become like a competitor to actually mine, first of all, the knowledge base is probably not there unless you've been in the mining space for 20, 30 years. So how would you find your own, and how would you find the money as a startup to get your own mine going? So you kind of have to work with them. And I think this is an uncomfortable truth. I see a lot of mixed opinions on this, but a lot of people do not like the idea of working with incumbents in this space because they have done the pollution, they have done the bad things. But at the end of the day, like that's the only way we can actually make an impact, is my opinion. If you convince them to change, like maybe you can speak to this. I would assume mining companies do have a lot of things in place to try to not pollute the environment around them, because they probably get humongous fines for doing so, right? Like maybe initially they didn't care, but now they start to care. Is that accurate assumption?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I can speak so much to my time in oil and gas where I've drilled wells onshore and offshore, but it's the same. You have the same environmental regulations. Safety is job number one. Like if we in our company culture, safety is job number one. It's the same with mining operators. Safety of people coming to work, going home safe is the most important thing everyone does every single day. Having huge ES and H and ESG groups is important because you have one planet. These things are reflected not just because you have to do them, because you get to do them. Renee, who leads business development for me, she has 20 years at BHP and Rio Tinto, and she's an environmental scientist by background. And Christy, who has 25 years at Freeport, like we all want to do this to make the world a better place. We want to mine once, we want to mine right. But at the same time, we want to empower our mining customers to make the best decisions with the data that they can do. Working with mining, well, first off, choosing not to work with mining customers, where are you going to get access to your ore? Where are you going to get access to your materials? Like I always kind of have to scratch my noggin at that one. And secondly, underestimating the talent and the compassion and the environmental focus of mining customers is really short-sighted, because having worked with them, there are so many brilliant, talented, environmentally focused engineers that work there that really do want to make the world a better place. When I was at Hess as an oil and gas geologist, all the geologists I worked for, we were all complete environmentalists. We were there because we wanted to make sure that if oil and gas wells were being drilled, they were done so with minimal impact. They were living up to the letter of the law. In fact, one of my mentors, when I was debating if I wanted to go there after my PhD, I was like, I don't know. And he's like, Liz, I guarantee you that every geologist I've ever worked with, if we could never use hydrocarbons for transportation again and all be out of work, we would do it in a heartbeat. We're not here because we want to take advantage of the environment. We're here because we want to make sure it's done correctly, and we have really cool rocks and really cool data to play with. It's because we appreciate that. And it's something that I've seen universally. The closer you are to the rocks and nature, the more you really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's something I've seen as well. Well, one thing you brought up in our kind of our intro call at one point was about focusing on, I think maybe that was my question to you, was focusing on hype versus doing the science, right? And I think there's a lot of, especially hard tech founders, who kind of get caught in this issue of like, how much do I go out there and just like talk about what we're doing and it's all talk so we can raise money, versus actually doing the science. And the thing that struck me when we spoke with Moji and I and you as well is like, it seems like you guys are just genuinely focused on doing the science to a point where the hype follows. But could you just talk about this a little bit? Because there seems to be an epidemic of founders who don't understand, especially how to deal with this, because they're either too focused on the hype, or they're too focused on just heads down doing the science, and they never go out and raise money.
Oh, it's so hard. So for instance, we've had some really cool hype events in the past month. We got into TechCrunch Disrupt, which is like Silicon Valley montage starts now. We came out of stealth mode with an article in TechCrunch. We made this World Economic Forum, top innovators. We've had so many cool hype press releases. Like when I was at events at Climate Week, people were coming up to me and being like, oh, Endolith, this is awesome. We want to chat with you, which has never, ever been the case before. Normally I'm there like, do you want to talk about copper? Can I tell you about microbes? So the tables have definitely turned tabled. But internally, we haven't celebrated that. We didn't have a cake. We didn't have team lunches being like, guys, we had a press release. Like we don't celebrate that. We celebrated Tia, one of our research associates that just got promoted to scientist. She's one of the best I've ever worked with. That's what we celebrate. We're going to have some large columns go up pretty soon. The running joke that is my own joke, so I think it's funny, is that we want them to go up on Halloween so we can put costumes on them. That we celebrate. When we get our technical OKRs, we will celebrate those. So those are the things that we will celebrate internally as a team. The hype is fine. It's great. It has this weird alluring pull where when people tell you how great you are, it has this talk like this intoxication that I have not realized before. So I can definitely
Mm.
see how people love being famous, but at the same time, that's not going to be who we are. We're going to try to keep our feet firmly planted in the subsurface and our head in our
Yeah.
beautiful cloud platform.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really nice how you're doing this. I really appreciate it from a talent
We're
perspective to
trying.
keep the team focused on those things and celebrate the right things about your team internally, and then the external pieces will follow. And obviously, you are doing a good job. Maybe you don't give you're not touting your own horn too much, but you're doing a good job of making sure you do kind of that branding exercise of getting people aware of what you're doing to some extent and being able to communicate it clearly, because a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, I went to the New Climate Futures event, and there's a bunch of these like mining related startups. I'd go and I'd ask them, so what you working on? And they start like talking PhD to me, and I don't get it. And I'm like, I'm sorry, like I need to be able to understand what you're doing. So this is what I'm trying to bring out, is that there has to be this kind of a bit of both. And especially interesting how you guys focus on keeping your team grounded, because otherwise you can get off the rails pretty easily.
It's, and don't get me wrong, like my ability to articulate the science and what we're doing is not an accident. I didn't wake up one day and was like, I can talk about science. I have had so many science journalism classes. I have had so many public speaking classes and media training. It is a fine, polished art because I enjoy it, but also I know it's important to the business. And so it's something I've spent the better part of 20 years now working on. So if someone's curious and they see people that seem to be pretty effortless in these things, know that, I mean, maybe some of them are, but for me, it's been a study. I'm always going over my old talks, taking notes, always seeking critical feedback. I mentioned internally that safety is our number one value. Critical feedback is number two, because how else do you improve if you're not learning what you can do better?
I'll mention two comments and then we can get to a completely non-controversial topic, which is politics. One is the adage, the public celebrates what you practice in private. And so just being able to over and over and over again dedicate to that, taking classes, like we wouldn't have known about that if we hadn't met you. So that's really commendable. And I think the second part is that I think aligning on a vision, one thing I wanted to call out, especially to the clean techies who are listening to this episode, is that I've noticed a trend in, the founders that we get to speak to. When you're working in a deep tech oriented field, you're working with really long timelines, right? We just
Yeah.
talked recently with the founder of Theia, which is a nuclear power plant, essentially. And so, just 70-year timeline, right? It's not him, but the science, right? So you really have to be good at getting your team aligned on being able to wait it out, right? And that, because that talent is invaluable. So getting them to understand that we are making progress, it just doesn't look as the 20 million Series A profitable software startup, right? It looks different. And I think from a talent perspective, even I'm sure Silas sees this too, like finding the right people who can do that is the hallmark of a good company. Moving into politics, though, we've talked already a lot about it. We've kind of made a
Yeah.
lot of great sort of generalizations about the space. I think one thing that I want to also talk about is how the US views it, because there's, a view of national security, there's also policy, just a general like do good climate focus. So how does the US view green mining? Like, have there been investments in this space, and do you see that being a tailwind we can expect?
Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in to the episode this far. This, unfortunately, is the end of the free preview, but it doesn't have to be the end of the entire episode for you. You can get the entire episode by going over to cleantechies.substack.com and becoming a paid subscriber. If you choose any level of paid subscription, you will get opportunity to listen to this entire episode with Liz, which is a banger, if I might add, and all of our other episodes, a full unfettered library. There's a lot of other bonus things we're working on. We promise we're going to keep beefing it up slowly. But if you want to get the whole thing, go check it out. If you have not already cashed in your kind of one-time only trial, you can also do that. This is probably a very worthy episode to do that for. So if you want to see what it's all about, get the rest of the episode. Maybe you're just going to freeload off of us for one episode. Fine. That's fine. But I think you're going to like it. So go over to cleantechies.substack.com/subscribe. Pick a paid subscription. Help us support what we're doing to make this thing go round. It does cost money and it costs a lot of time. So if you guys like it, we appreciate your support. And hopefully we will see you on the other side of that paid subscription. Thank you so much.